Okay, well, welcome. Good afternoon. Happy April to all of you. It's another Thursday, so happy Thursday. Pheng here again, he, him, his with the Men and Masculine Folks Network and continuing our series of conversations, of kitchen table conversations um, with men across the state of Minnesota here talking about things that are maybe relevant issues and experiences, current topics and events that are, and how we as men and masculine folks really navigate that and striving to be healthy and committed and involved in community, right? So without further ado, I'll let my other folks here, community members, siblings here, brothers, introduce themselves before I continue as always into what we're going to be actually conversating about today.
I'm Roderic, and I'm calling in with you from Minneapolis. Glad to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felix Martinez. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm reporting from Eagan, Minnesota.
Reporting in from Duluth, I'm Sean, pronouns he, him, and his. It's really foggy here, and I'm glad to be back with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. And as always, we appreciate Austin for being able to actually be with us and be with all of you who are watching us live on Facebook at this moment or wherever you may be. He will be engaging with all of you via chat and letting us know what your thoughts are about the conversation that we're going to have about today. We thought that it might be relevant to really talk about the trial and giving our reactions, but looking at the deeper pieces of our relationship as men and masculine folks to what's actually unfolding in Minneapolis, right? The trial meaning the Derek Chauvin trial, the murder of George Floyd. And what does that mean to us as men and masculine folks within our own communities? How are we navigating as we're hearing bits and pieces, or if we're watching the trial live all the time, like, well, what's our sense of connection to it? What's our relationship to it? How do we understand it? What's unraveling and what's unfolding for us? Where are the places where we're struggling? Where are the places where we may have tensions? And so that's the conversation that we're going to have today in our 17th Kitchen Table Series conversation, is really our reactions to that, but just not only our reactions and our reflections, but our deeper connection to a sense of what is justice and how do we as men perhaps, and masculine folks perhaps, create what is justice, or how do we maintain structures of patriarchy and patriarchal practices and policies as things unfold within the criminal justice system, and what's our relationship to the criminal justice system as men and masculine folks from different communities, right? Because we know that substantially the criminal justice system is one way of finding and seeking justice, but it is not the only way in which justice can be achieved. Now, that doesn't mean that people can be vigilantes and go and do what they want to do, and it's not a free-for-all, but I do believe that we have to think about alternative ways and alternative options for individuals who may not want to actually seek justice through the criminal justice system, right? So what is the community accountability piece in this, and what is our role in this as men and masculine folks? So just starting off the conversation and thinking about it in that way, and really allowing for all of my friends and colleagues and brothers and siblings here to also share their thoughts about, like, well, what's on your heart at this moment as the trial has been unraveling? What's on your heart?
Hello, everyone. Right now in my heart, I'm worried for my community. I'm worried what it could come from this, what is happening right now. I feel fear, mistrust in the police. I think, I only not see that in myself. I'll also see it in my Latino community. In my case, is having the time to have these type of conversations with my daughter about systematic oppression, racial justice, and be sure my daughters feel safe. that they can not also advocate for themselves, but also for our community, because we're all part of our community. So it's interesting to start to listen what's been happening day by day in the case, and that is being live streamed too. That's something that's new. I don't think that's that common to see something like that. But the importance of the police department, to, like you mentioned, the police reform, the police get trained with escalation, tactics in order to prevent that. But when you see the cases and how the communities of color have been affected when a white person is arrested versus a community of color, it's pretty obvious that there's something there, that there's more things that we need to work out, as a whole. But the importance of having these conversations and letting our, the youth know that they're safe there, but we have the responsibility to take accountability and make those individuals accountable for what they, what they did. Nobody's perfect. I think we all make mistakes. I think I wouldn't call this a mistake, but we're better than that. So I think it's time to stand up, and fight in order to create a better future with more equity and, more peace.
I think appreciate what you shared there, Felix, too, and thinking about what's been on my heart or how my heart has been feeling in the last 2 weeks. I think just like the first thing that comes to mind is just like a heavy sadness. And I think, Felix, what you said about being worried too, I think there's definitely some of that in me too, like worrying about the outcomes and how the people that I love and care about in communities of color, how they're doing, and what, what is my role as a white, man, masculine person, and how do I actually like reach out in a good way to like connect and show care for those people in this time. Because I just really, if I'm feeling these things, and I am not a part of those communities, I really cannot imagine what folks, especially in the Black community, as well as Latino and Hmong communities, and all the different folks of color who are seeing this unfold for like the 1,000th or millionth, I don't even know, like it's just something that, as I'm learning and growing and paying more attention to like what is really going on in the world, I think that is just like a heaviness, and there feels like a responsibility that I'm not exactly sure what it is for me, but like there is something that I need to be doing. And I think maybe many folks right now are wondering like, what is that thing? Like we don't always know. And I think for me, like I'm always trying to think about what is the right, thing to do. And there isn't a right thing. There's just a caring thing and reaching out to those folks. And so I guess, yeah, that's what's on my heart right now.
Yeah, it is a time, that is for sure. I think between the trial and what's going on in Georgia, and actually even what's going on, the discrepancies between the pay gap for athletes, male and female, all of that is stirring kind of at the same time for me. And so I think that I think that I always think it's very curious that like the city is bracing, right? And they talk about the bracing for the outcome, and which really confuses me, because I would suggest that, are you bracing for, what do you think is justice? I guess that gets us to that question, right? Because I was going to say, the city's really bracing for injustice not to be done is my first and sort of the thing that rolls off most clearly is it's not done and people respond to justice not happening. And then I had to go, wait a minute, that is what I consider justice, right? So I need to be sort of mindful not to plaster that on people. But I also, I think, would suggest that this is a moment where there's an opportunity for people to start talking about things as a sense of justice or not justice, not just the outcome of a trial, but whether justice was done and and what their responsibility is. Even so much that I think that the conversation about sort of police policing poor folks and communities of color so often differently, right, than other folks, and then being on jury bodies, jury pools who say, that's okay, right, who give leeway. So I'm like, well, so who's, you know, I kind of suggest maybe that, you know, the society gets the policing that they demand or that they want, right? So it kind of, I think, implicates all of us in the same way that I think that, and so what does justice mean to us? I think sometimes it means our comfort, right? As men not being dishonored, whatever we think that is. And I think as sometimes it means just feeling safe, right? So I think there are lots of relationships that we have to justice, and it would be interesting for a great airing out of sort of what that means for folks.
Well, no, I could totally connect and relate to what you were sharing there, Roderic, in terms of all the ways in which you had just shared there. I think on top of the events that you named with what's happened in Georgia and things like that, I think it's also really relevant to also name how the states could also police people's gender expressions and the ways in which people who want to identify, right? And undoubtedly, in the most unfortunate fashion, Arkansas became one of those states, right? A day or 2 days ago, in terms of saying anybody under the age of 18 cannot and will not be able to actually receive any kind of support, basically through therapy or other means, to actually be the kind of person that they want to be in the identity that they want to be, right? And it's so unfortunate. And it continues to be the policing that you were talking about in terms of the marginalized identities of like that these are the only identities that we want, right? Which is pretty mainstream, and these other folks need to be policed to conform, police so that they can be safe, right? Because we should determine their safety. So even in that law, as an example here in this conversation, is that law is saying we need to keep these kids safe, right? It is about the safety of kids. It is about the safety of other children. It is about the safety of community. And that's why we need to be implementing and overreaching, as the governor of Arkansas said, overreach our stretch as the state legislatures and say, hey, you can't be expressing your total gender identity the way that you want to because you're under 18 and you don't know yet, right? But many of the times we know that people know, kids know at a very young age, right? So it brings me to like the way, like policing in general, right? And how that looks like and what is considered safety and who is saying what is safe and who is saying what is not safe, right? And we teach that a lot to women and girls and queer folks in this society and people of color, that they're not safe in this society, right? That especially the women and girls, when you go to like sexual assault service centers or domestic violence places. You teach women how to keep safe. You have pamphlets, you have leaflets on self-defense. You have like, don't walk alone at night, or here's a light if you need it, or you should walk with somebody, right? So you're teaching them it's an unsafe world out there, right? And then who you should be safe with, right? So you're teaching them to also say who are the kinds of men that you should be associating yourself with to be safe, right? And that tends to oftentimes be the ones that we see portrayed as heroes in movies and in media, and it tends to be white men, cisgender white men, right? Who come and save, and that safety. So I think it's such a nuance and conversation about safety and justice and where it interplays and how it interplays with one another and who then actually shapes it and who then actually gets to say. And so I'm thinking about all of that, and I think about like in the deeper ways, but I think about like the very practical sense of like my own relationship to how it's actually unfolding in terms of the trial as well. And I try not to watch it because it brings up a lot of parallels to my own past history and experiences of my sister's murder trial, right? And so I don't watch it because of that. And so I pick bits and pieces of it. Um, and, and and I think I worry about the outcome, right? And I worry about, similar to how I worried about like, what if at the end of the day he wasn't convicted, but it was like everything was there to show that he was there, right? And in this case, the same way for Derek Chauvin was that he was there and people had it on camera, but yet at the end, if people are like, no, it didn't fit the statute, or there wasn't enough doubt, and beyond a reasonable doubt, there wasn't enough of that. And so yeah, so it brings up a lot of like my own personal trauma to it. And so sometimes I don't watch it. I only watch bits and pieces of it. And it's a parallel to me oftentimes about what justice is and what that really means. And yeah, so it just brings those things out from me.
I was just thinking about, how would I define justice? And it sort of just, it feels like one of these gigantic words that how would you define it? And it seems like there would be different kinds of ways, like, like I might define it slightly different than Felix or you, Pheng, or Roderic, right? But it's got me thinking about, even the history of this country and, like white European folks coming over because they felt that they were experiencing injustice, and then only to come over and to then create all of this harm and violence in this sort of, mission to find their own, like at the expense of all these other folks, right? And, when I think about the criminal justice system, that's like this whole gigantic thing that I have not studied deeply, but, like who created those systems, who created the laws, who created, the role of judge and jury and all of these things. And my assumption would be that that's white folks, white cisgender men who have, historically been the ones allowed at that table or in the room. And so thinking about the ways that, like there's no good way that one group of people, one community can like create this gigantic definition that can then include all of these other folks and communities and cultures. And it seems so obvious to me that like how do we still allow this system, like when we know that history, to continue, and maybe is it just because it feels like this huge thing that we can't necessarily define easily, or and not or, and, you know, the powers that be who want to keep that all of those systems in place because it benefits them directly and their descendants. So, you know, what is justice? Like, I don't think it's just probably more than half of the laws, you know, that folks are, and sentencing and all of these different ways that this system harms folks of color, specifically folks within the LGBTQ plus community as well. And yeah, it just makes me think about this idea of right and wrong and who actually defines that. Pheng, like what you're saying, like who actually gets to define this is the ideal version of humanity, and if you don't conform to this, then you're going to experience harm and violence, and that's okay.
Yeah, I agree with what you say, Sean, and what everybody has said at this point. But as a minorities, I think we're teach to don't challenge the systems, you know, to be scared of the systems, that we don't have a place of power to create change. So it get you to a point that protect yourself, try to protect your family just because you don't think there's nothing you can do. And now, you know, as an adult, start learning more and start educating myself and trying to educate my circles about, yeah, we have a voice. We need to step up, you know, we need to challenge those systems, you know, and that makes you think about policy right away, you know, so how we can, you know, create policies that are more fair, or educate ourselves in policy so we can, you know, when we make a step, that step is a stronger step that it can create more action. And as a community, how we need to work together in order to create that change. So, but yeah, listening to you guys, it just made me think, yeah, growing up, I thought I didn't have any power, and, you know, and we're supposed to just listen and respect the police. Even at this point, I'm a 44-year-old man that if a police car stopped me, I get nervous, I start shaking, you know, and I'm a white Latino, you know, but is that something stuck in my mind that if I right away think that something bad is going to happen, you know, and if you put yourself, if you're black and a cop stop you, how are you going to feel, you know, right now after we all seen what's going on, you know, it's there's no justice, I think, you know. I know we cannot think that, you know, they're all bad cops. There are good cops out there, but just them being silenced are part of what is happening right now. So yeah, it's sad, you know, when you think in justice, you think in, you know, equity, you know, everybody's seen as a person, not by the color of the skin or by your gender, but those are the things that we need to be sure that those people in power start making changes, you know, in gun reform, you know, something that I think Biden is supposed to speak today about, you know, about some changes. That's going to be interesting to hear what his plan. But yeah, be sure that those policies, you know, bring equity and support, and, you know, it's hard to see that, you know, we think about, we need to step, you know, we need to start over, and whatever happened in the past, it happened in the past. It's not, you know, that stay with us, you know, it's a trauma that keep existing in us, and we're starting to see, you know, the removals of, you know, monuments, you know, from, you know, the Confederate flag, you know, you're starting to see changes in sport teams, you know, with their logos, you know, on Jemima, you know, I think there's a lot of things that are starting to change because it's starting to open our minds to realize, you know, that maybe, you know, there's something behind it, and something that's still causing harm. So yeah, I don't know, I'll leave it there.
You know, I was listening to this thing the other day on honor culture. And they were talking about sort of, you know, the home is my domain, right? You're the king of your kingdom, right? You're king of your home, right? And that being something that was exported into the consciousness of this country. And then they talked about, you know, stand your ground. So the original stand your ground was your castle, right? And then stand your ground laws where, you know, you kind of take your privilege and your fears, right? Wherever you go, right? And then they were talking about sort of honor culture. And when I think of honor culture, that sort of, I think we've talked about it for sure, but I don't think we've called it honor culture. That sense of those things that make me feel dishonored are those things that I think are that I need to fight against. And I think of when I think of that, I tend to think of it, try to put in the context of the trial, right? And to the point earlier, both the trial and how we're watching the trial, right? And what we're saying justice is. And so to the extent that Chauvin dishonored that other officers feel like he's dishonored the uniform, is the willingness they have to toss him over the wall, right? They talked about tossing him over the blue wall and not protecting him, right? And I thought that was interesting because he's not the first, he's not going to be the last to do something like this, and I just wonder how long. I wonder who made the decision, first of all, for them to toss him over the wall and say he's a sacrificial lamb so that we don't have to change. Because I think part of that, when you toss someone away, or when we as men sometimes tell other men, you need to stop right there, we're sometimes doing it sort of not to reform ourselves, if you will, but to say, what you look like publicly is making me uncomfortable and is rubbing off on what people think of me, right? As opposed to the more reforming work that we could do with men. We will ostracize them and say, you're bad, and sort of being more rehabilitative, I would say. And I'm not suggesting there necessarily that, I guess I am suggesting that rehabilitation be something that we think about as an expectation for our relationships with men, as opposed to tossing them out and continue to do business the same way, right? Because it does, when you toss people out, it does allow you to continue uninterrupted the harm that you're doing, right? It doesn't really force you to really dig around in that harm that you're doing. So there you go.
I think that's so true, Roderic. I think that you are right on spot in terms of how patriarchal cultures actually move and get maintained. Is let's just weed out the people who are the bad apples, right? And it's at the end of the day, it's still that person's choice, right? Whether it is that person being the one that's doing the hitting, that person the one that making the violence choice, whatever the case may be, yes. But there is a responsibility here, both on the community and in the systems, which is the police system or the criminal justice system, that needs to actually say, we're not perfect and we understand we have to keep reforming ourselves, right, quote unquote, or let other alternatives emerge as well too, right? But to be able to like gatekeep and not do any of that and not allow for other alternative ways of community accountability or justice to actually emerge says that this is the only way, right? And then people, to Felix's point, I think people feel a sense of distrust and a sense of like being unvalued and unheard when you don't get seen in that system, right? And we hear this so much from sexual assault survivors who don't get seen, women in particular, and girls and queer folks who report sexual violence, who report sexual assault, who report rape, and they don't get seen in that system, right? In the criminal justice system, they get reharmed in that system. They don't get the kind of justice that they want, right? Because they have to then defend themselves of like, what did you do that didn't lead you to be assaulted in this way, right? And so definitely, I think that that's, and then they lose hope in that system, right? They lose faith, and much to some of folks of color who've experienced that system and who've lost faith in that system and said that they're not helping me. They're actually just exacerbating the problem. Or to Felix's point, I have to find my own way to actually resolve it. And I've seen it. I've seen it so many times in that system where it has worked and where it hasn't worked, and where you've got all the evidence, but the person that is done the harm gets away or gets a slap on the wrist. And we've seen that so many times, right? But nuance it a little bit more. Who gets the slap on the wrist often and who doesn't, right? And then that's when the race parts comes in, that we have to actually make real and be thinking about is, yes, men of color, particularly Black men, are criminalized at a higher rate and seen as criminals much more than any other community of men in this society, right? Because of the history of enslavement. And then just like on a different side note to Sean's point earlier, I can't help but also share and bring up like the jury selection part of it, right? Of like selecting impartial jurors. Undoubtedly, I think that people probably put their best thinking forward, but it's like, how do we also be bringing people to actually help create a system with best thinking often, right? And not just like a one-time thing only. I can't help but remember this one juror in my sister's case where she said she didn't believe that Hmong folks should be here. And so she wasn't going to, undoubtedly she was honest because she wasn't going to be impartial. And then she didn't believe in indigenous folks living on this land as well too, even though they belonged on this land, right? So she was like, I didn't really care about this case. Basically, that's what she's saying to me. You know, it's like, I really don't care about your sister's life and what justice means to you and your family. You know, even though I'm in community and in society with you all, your lives actually don't matter. The life of the person who's done harm, you know, and the person who suffered harm, their lives actually don't matter, because I don't believe that they should have been here in the first place, meaning Hmong folks, Asian folks should be here. And then for indigenous folks, it's like they don't even exist, you know? And so I think about that of like how that plays into, and it isn't just that one example, right? But we've seen so many examples, particularly in the South, where a lot of white folks became jurors and judging and saying whose life matters and whose life doesn't actually matter. And I think that there's many cases that have demonstrated that, the Emmett Till case being one of those, right?
Just pondering. Yeah, I feel like the silence, you know, is okay, because I think we all are sort of processing this too. And yeah, partiality, what is just, what is right, who, it seems more about who is believed to be impartial. And yeah, just the idea of someone not being biased, that seems ridiculous to me. Like we are all biased, and that seems so clear to me. And yet, you know, for the system to sort of still be trying to operate in this way, where it's like, you know, a very binary system, like with the black and white and right and wrong. And I don't know, it's just also making me think about, you know, the ways in which, you know, I decide in my own life, you know, what I think is right or wrong, or who's right or wrong in like an argument with my wife or whatever. Like we all sort of come from this place of like, or it feels like, to me, it feels like we come from a place of, or a belief that each of us, you know, individually are, you know, inherently good. And so that whatever our belief is about this community, about this person, about this police officer on trial, it's just like, it's got me thinking about individualism and collectivism as well, because if we, you know, if we can't see our own bias, like on this individual level, if we aren't open to seeing that, then it feels like to me that there's no way that then you can make a jump to like, well, there's these systems then in place that are created by these individuals with the biases. And so, you know, it just has me thinking about, you know, the people in my life who, you know, I think would share sort of that code of blue silence, or, you know, whatever, like just, you know, believing that every police officer is right in their in how they respond to community members and whatever those situations are. And it just makes me think about, I was recently watching this TV show, and there was a scene where you know, it's like about these high school kids, and they're at this party, and a young woman is basically drugged, and this group of men take her upstairs, and there's one guy, you know, the one heroic guy, who's this young white teenager who comes in and busts it up and like saves the girl. And I just thought it was really interesting, because the way that the storyline then went, there was like no discussion about, or no even conversation about, well, we need to hold these guys accountable. It was just like, oh, well, that happens. You know, this one guy stood up to his buddies and like saved the girl, but then it was like there was nothing that happened after. These guys just continued going on with their lives, and who knows, like the next party, right? That same thing may happen, and that guy may not be there. And so it's just has me thinking about the way that you know, the ways where, and the places where I stay silent, and what is that like, where does that come from? Like a place of fear within myself, of speaking up, of being that person to like go against the flow or whatever. But it just feels like there's so much power that we as men and masculine folks already kind of have. And if we were to start wielding that in sort of a collective, caring way, like what could be possible, you know, if we could all sort of collectively wake up and stop being a part of the silence.
You know, Sean, I was going to say it's interesting, because I think that it's interesting about the absence after the show that you were talking about. But it's also interesting. There was an artist that did this thing called "Nothing's Changed Except There Are Now Cameras," right? And so it makes me wonder how many other times, the discussion I would have liked to have with those guys was, how many other times did this happen that, one, let you know, that greased the wheels of how easy it was for a group of you to do this, right? You know, what you have obviously been in other circumstances, right, that said, this is okay, this is how we organized, right? Because though it wasn't clumsy, right? So it makes me wonder about sort of the things that we watch, and maybe going back, digging back a little bit and going, there's a reason why you knew to do this when, or you thought you could get away with this, right? Or what's that framework? When you were talking about thinking about justice and thinking, I always think people should think about sort of what your cultural framework is that provides you with that specific lens. I mean, I do think it's different for everyone. I mean, I think we have, for better or worse, just enough tolerance to let the worst parts of it remain undiscussed.
I was thinking of the parallels, you know, and I think we briefly touched on it earlier too, but I want to lift it up again, is that the parallel silence is really around containing and maintaining the power structures at play and the privileges that are at play, whether it be in the police force, which is the code of blue silence, or whether it is amongst men and masculine folks. These things are parallel to each other. They actually interact with one another. And the way in which I think we question our own silence in that is that I know when we talk to young men and boys, there's a risk involved, right? You can then be targeted. You can then be the one that now have to give up your life to protect those of others. But isn't that what we teach boys and young men to do already? Right? Is to protect others and to give their life up in some ways for others. But yet when the caveat to that obviously is a privileged place. The caveat to that is the power place, the not being seen as a man, the not being seen as masculine, the now being seen as something else, the now you're a part of that, now you've betrayed us, now you've betrayed this silence, right? And I think that that's what each of us as men and masculine folks in that silence have to work through for ourselves of like, what does that mean? What does that look like for me? What does it mean for me to give up certain parts of how I've been socialized, letting go of some of those earned privileges? When I don't get that earned privilege, what does it mean anymore? And it all goes to, in some relationship, it all goes to your question earlier, Sean, for me, of who is believed in the system? Who is believed, right? In patriarchal societies and cultures, we believe men often, right? Cisgender men often, because whatever they say goes. They're telling the truth, you know, and without a lot of evidence, and it always goes back for me to sexual violence cases where all the man has to say was, it was consensual. She didn't. That's all that he had to say. Or all that we had to think about was, I remember clearly the cases a few years ago, right? There's many college campuses rape cases, but the one out east, I remember, I forgot where, but it was like, let's think about these boys' future. Right? Let's think about the kind of future that they're not going to have. But nobody have ever once thought about the women or the girls who have experienced that violence and their future and how they're going to have to live now with that trauma, to Roger's point, how they're going to have to deal with the harm that's happened, that's severely impacted who they are moving forward. And now they're going to be able to not be able to make choices that are healthy, maybe at times, right? Not to say that people can't recover or can't heal, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. And I think we have to think about those things. I think about Floyd's family who's watching all of these things unfold, right? And watched it and then now having to watch it again. And so it's things of like, I think it's so much and it's so nuanced that we have to actually look at it in real ways. And I think my relationship to it as a man is in the figuring out of not to be silent is I have to say something. I have to say something. Because it's about the principle rather than about, and the value rather than about what is right and what is wrong, or who am I going to stand with and who I shouldn't stand with. But I think, how do we act on the value and on the principle and trying to strive to be healthy as men, right?
Yeah, the question that comes to me right now is, who's going to break that silence? Whose responsibility, comes to, community. The first thing that comes to my mind is the government. Obviously we understand that some communities don't feel they have the power to make change, and that's the reason why they're silent. Why we elect officials that they're in positions of power and they're also silent. It's difficult, to try to open up and be vulnerable, and like Pheng said, make that first step, and then be in a position that people are gonna start looking at you differently, or they're not gonna respect you, or they're gonna start trying to attack your family just because they don't agree with you. But breaking the silence it's not simple. It's not simple, but it needs to start in some way. It needs to start with us. It needs to start with our families. It needs to start, yeah, like repeating myself, like making, you know, those people in power, you know, putting them in a position that they need to make a decision that's going to benefit, you know, our communities. And like Pheng says, reflected in, you know, sexual assault, it's reflected in life. So I think it needs to start somewhere, but for me, I'm in a position to start thinking, and I think it needs to start from the top, just to start from the president, start making those decisions that's gonna make a lot of people uncomfortable, but it needs to start in that position, so maybe that can motivate or influence some people, or inspire some people to start creating this movement of, like Sean say, of men, you know, good men started making right decision and making accountable those that they're not.
I tend to think there's a rhythm to how these things play out historically, and I think that it would be what I'm trying to be more mindful of is that history, because I think that if I'm trying to think about sort of what happened, I'm looking back at history and what happens when these cases, you know, are decided, and then what comes next, and what causes us to kind of get back in the same cycle again, right? Whether it's with some guy I'm trying to say, hey, you know, you shouldn't have done that, or with, in this case, a police trial. I think being mindful of what the cycle is and trying to use your energy and your voice strategically, um, so that you kind of intervene at a particular place. Because I think constant intervention becomes a cycle that kind of falls in line with all of the other cycles, right? And so trying to think about sort of how to disrupt that piece I can touch in a way that that sticks, right? And clarifies for others and myself maybe a strategy to put an end to some of this circular justice, if you will, or circular injustice, perhaps.
And I guess for me, like I feel like I'm thinking a lot more about the systems and you know, kind of the way that I was brought up. You know, I was taught to believe and trust in these systems, and to, you know, like there's a right way to like report crime and doing all these things the right way. You know, it makes me think of like the indigenous folks who pulled down the Columbus statue, you know, like afterwards, I think it was people were saying, you know, we actually did jump through all of these governmental hoops. We have filled out the paperwork, we have sent letters, we have done all of those right things, and still this thing stands here and we have to walk by it every day. And I think about, I won't be able to think of her name, but the representative who was knocking on the governor's door and was arrested. And I think if the system actually doesn't work the way it's designed to, where you could go and knock on someone's door and say, hey, I have this issue, and this is serious and this is harming my entire community, like clearly that system is not trustworthy anymore, right? And I think communities of color have known this for so long, right? And have experienced the violence, and it just, yeah, it makes me, I guess I'm kind of thinking more about like I don't know, like as trans folks, we figure out how to navigate these systems, you know, in a way like where you're thinking about healthcare. Well, if I want to have this done, I've got to get this letter and this letter and this letter, but how can we kind of figure out our way to navigate through these systems that are not set up for us? And it brings me back to like the power within community, because I wouldn't be able to navigate that system on my own. I've got this whole community who's like, we get it, we know this is not cool and it's not the way it's supposed to work, and so we're going to help you kind of figure this out. And yeah, just thinking more about community solutions, you know, within the specific communities, right? The nuances we've talked about, like within the Black community, within the Latino, among LGBT plus community, like it just, yeah, how can we, and I think communities are doing this and have been doing this, right? Like we take care of our own, that's kind of that thing, but like how can we sort of expand that out? How can we be looking at you know, ways that Black folks are taking care of each other in this time and are thinking about healing and thinking about how do we care for each other and get through this horrible thing together, this trial. Like how can that sort of, like, how do we learn from each other? Because I think there's just so much that I don't know and wouldn't be able to know if it weren't for my community of people stepping in and being like, hey, I've actually done this thing and I know how to do that and I'm going to help you get there. And so it's just, yeah, it's just interesting as I'm, you know, I'm personally learning more about sort of these other ways that we can look at justice and like what does it look like for communities to determine that and to create systems within the communities. And you know, it's like the reforming the police thing sort of, I'm tired of that conversation, and I've only heard it for a couple of years as I've been learning, you know, myself being this younger person and kind of waking up to the realities that folks of color in this community face. Yeah, and how do we then like lift up the community response? Because that seems like it's really like where stuff is happening. Communities are taking care of each other outside of these systems that were supposedly going to be taking care of all of us, right? So how can we, where can we learn from that and from each other, you know?
Definitely, support what you're sharing and agree with you, what you're sharing, John, in terms of like, um, there has been communities who've been doing this on their own for a long time because they've jumped through all the hoops and they still get the same result. And the systems, whether it be the criminal justice system or other forms of systems and institutions, right? The government, police departments, social service departments, Department of Health and Human Services, things like that. It takes so much, and it's like what one of our colleagues said the other day. It's like moving a boulder, and you're only moving an inch at a time. But what we're saying is that's not enough because there's an urgency around people dying, people being killed in communities of color, right? People being harmed. And so that inch moving isn't saving people's lives, right? So how do you actually think about alternative ways and other ways in which people's lives can actually be saved? And one of those things that I constantly think about is my experience and time on the fatality review team in Hennepin County, where we reviewed a lot of domestic violence homicide cases. And every time we always suggested intervention points. What are the intervention points, right? And it helps shapes the policy, but it doesn't save people's lives, right? It didn't save that person from being killed, right? And so, but everybody, what we always knew and saw from those cases that reviewed, or at least through my observation that I've seen, is that family members knew that this was coming, or they had some inclination or some idea that this was what was happening, right, in a domestic violence situation. and that this person might be in harm's way, but they didn't know and then didn't have the tools to act upon it and to intervene or to do something about it, right? It goes back to our point about the silence. And we know that family members are silent about harm that's caused within family, right? It's easier to point it out when it's somebody outside of the family, right? Because you don't have the like, oh, am I going to betray my father? Am I going to betray my son, my father, my son-in-law, whoever the case it may be, right? That's the human aspect that we have to work with. So what is the aspect that we have to work with that doesn't actually then get us bounded to Roger's point earlier, bounded to the police to then respond, right? What are the cases we should say, hey, the police should respond to these cases? And then what are the cases where we're saying, hey, the police responding to these cases aren't going to be helpful? And I know communities where communities are saying, hey, these are situations we're not going to call the police, and they resolved it in some ways themselves. And then there are cases where they're like, we're going to call the police. And it's like, why do you call the police in this case, but not over here? Right. And so it's like we're in this really funky relationship with safety, going back to the safety conversation. And so I think that that's like where I'm at sitting is like, how are we bounded into the safety conversation in a very funky way? And then who then tells us what safety looks like and what it means, you know, through the course of this conversation. And I know we're getting close to time here, so I want to make sure that you all get to also share your last thoughts on this conversation. And we can always pick it up because it obviously always intersects with other conversations we have as well too.
Well, this conversation gives me energy to take in more of the Chauvin case because I had been avoiding it because it's just like that and everything else is just insane.
Yeah, this conversation made me open my eyes and yeah, remind me to have these conversations with, with my family members and, create awareness of the systems and start looking for ways to change the system that, like you guys are mentioning, it's the cycle going and going and going. A lot of changes, but we're still stuck in the same spot. So what's next? What are those next steps we need to do? We need to do it as a community, together, Latinos, monks, everybody, need to get together and start looking for ways that show more love, more empathy, and more peace.
Yeah, I think I'm resonating with kind of what was brought up earlier and what you just shared too, Felix, about like the little like baby steps and the little reforms. And it's just got me thinking about how I think we're so used to that being the way that things like that change happens in these small incremental steps. And what does it look like for us to be like, I'm actually going to leap over. I'm going to make this bigger leap. I'm tired of doing these small incremental steps that have only gotten us to this point where, the whole country is watching this trial and is worried about what the outcome will be. And yeah, feels it feels like something bigger and I don't know, a bigger leap is needed in the way that we can imagine into the community that we like want to see in the future, like the one that we're all sort of building to in our individual ways, like the ways that we're working on healing and accountability as men and masculine people, and also like on this grander scale of like what can our world look like if we actually do make these bigger leaps, if not just one of us broke that code of silence, but what if a gigantic group of us did it all at once? So yeah, I think I'm feeling some hope and also just, still a lot of heaviness personally. And I think that's okay. I think whatever we're feeling in this time is exactly what we need to be feeling. And so, yeah, I'm not gonna try to put guilt or shame or anything on how I'm feeling, and I hope that others will not either. Like, let yourselves process in whatever way feels good to you. And yeah, we're really glad that you were able to join us for this conversation. Those of you who are here with us live, and those who are watching in some other way, maybe in the future. But thank you for being with us, for having these conversations. We just really believe at the Men and Masculine Folks Network that this needs to happen. These conversations have to happen, even though we don't have answers all the time, and we don't necessarily know how to answer, and there's these moments of silence, and I think that's real. That's what real conversations look like. So we're hoping to be modeling that, so that folks at home, including myself, can start really putting these things into practice. So thanks again for joining us on our 17th Kitchen Table Conversation. We want to take a minute to just thank our funding partners, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, the Novo Foundation, as well as the Women's Foundation, for their support and partnership in these ongoing conversations. And just as a reminder, these are happening bi-weekly, so every other Thursday at noon Central Time. So our next conversation will be on Thursday, April 22nd at noon. So we hope that you'll join us for that. And don't forget to like our Facebook page. You'll see updates and notifications about when we're going live next. And you can also find all of our previous conversations on our YouTube channel. So we encourage you to check those out as well. But I just want to lift up each of you in appreciation for being in my life and having these conversations with me. Lots of gratitude. And we hope you all have a good 2 weeks. We'll see you back